Hello, hello, beautiful listener. My name is AP Mobley, and I'm your host here at the Myths and Folktales and Fairy Tales podcast. I'm also the author of dark fantasy inspired by mythology, so if you ever wanted to check out my books, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, so I have some explaining to do. I said in the introductory episode that episode 8 of the Stories That Shaped Me section of the podcast would be about Artemis and Orion. But at the end of my last episode, I told you that I was going to change the topic to something else, and that I'd explain why. I'll start by saying that the new topic for this episode is on something from Welsh mythology, the Cauldron of Rebirth. More on that later, of course, because I need to explain why I changed the topic. As I've said countless times now, this first section of the podcast is titled The Stories That Shaped Me, and I genuinely feel that everything I've talked about so far is relevant to that theme. All of these stories are connected to special childhood memories, and all of them except for, I think, Perseus and Andromeda prompted me to look deeper into the subjects they're related to. So here's the thing. As I was writing out the bullet points for what was going to be the Artemis and Orion episode, I realized that while Artemis and Orion's story is one of my all time favorites from mythology, and I'll never get sick of it, it's not connected to any special childhood memories. Not like how I connect the myth of Heracles to me watching Disney's Hercules with my cousins, or how I connect Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid to my second grade teacher being so kind as to give me one of the books from her classroom library. It also didn't prompt me to look deeper into Greek mythology. I read it because I was already interested in Greek mythology. Now, I'm not going to lie. When I realized this, I panicked a little bit. I promised you 8 episodes in the opening section of the podcast, and I was afraid I was going to have to cancel the last episode and move straight into the creation, afterlife, and underworld myths section. However, after thinking about it a little bit, I realized that I'd overlooked an element of mythology that I connect a fond childhood memory to, the Cauldron of Rebirth, which is from Welsh mythology, like I said. I genuinely don't know how I overlooked this when I was first making the lineup for this section, because I've literally talked about the Cauldron of Rebirth on my blog before. Maybe it's because of how much I love the story of Artemis and Orion and how excited I was at the idea of talking about it with you. But at any rate, we'll discuss that one in the future. For now, let's get into why I picked the Cauldron of Rebirth for this episode. First off, have you ever seen Disney's animated film The Black Cauldron? I can promise you, this episode is not about that movie. I haven't been able to stand watching it in a long time, but it's important that I mention it. It was originally released in 1985, and it came out on VHS in 1998, when I was very small. Back when I could actually stand to watch it, I really enjoyed it. I loved how dark it is. I mean, who doesn't love an army of zombies and or walking skeletons? And I thought Eilonwy was cool. Fast forward to the 6th grade. I had the best teacher ever. I will never forget her. And she said that we, as a class, were going to read a book together. She asked us if we'd ever watched Disney's The Black Cauldron, because that movie is loosely based on the series the book we were going to read is from. I got excited because I was like, I really enjoy that movie. And my teacher was like, you're not going to enjoy it for long because the book series is so much better. And, well, she was right. The book series is so much better that I can't stand the movie now. The book we read in class is called The Book of Three, and it's the first installment in the Chronicles of Prydain series by Lloyd Alexander, which I'll be sure to link in the description in case you wanted to check it out. After we finished reading The Book of Three, I had to know what came next for Taran, Eilonwy, Gwydion, Gurgi, Henwyn, and Fflewddur. So I read the rest of the series even though we weren't reading the other books in class. Years later, when I had my own money, I bought a box set edition of the series for my personal library, and I've read it several times since. It's my very favorite children's book series, and I'm so grateful that my teacher had us read book 1, because I don't know if I would have found out about the series otherwise. It was published in the 1960s, and the only time I ever really hear people talking about it is when they're talking about its film adaptation. Anyway, you might be wondering what all this has to do with the Cauldron of Rebirth from Welsh mythology. Well, in my box set edition of the Chronicles of Prydain series, there's an author note at the very beginning of Book of Three, where Lloyd Alexander explains that the series is inspired by Welsh mythology. He says that Prydain and many of his main characters are from his own imagination, but that there are obvious nods to the mythology throughout the books, such as Iran, Gwydion, and a horrible cauldron that raises people from the dead. While Alexander drew on all sorts of elements from the mythology, for me personally, the Black Cauldron is the most memorable part. Whenever I think about this series, I think about the wonderful characters, yes. But as far as the magical elements go, I mostly think about the Black Cauldron and the dreaded Cauldron Born. So when I got this box set and I began my reread of the series and I read that author note, I got really excited to see that the Black Cauldron was originally based in mythology. When I'd first read the series, I had no idea. And so I did some quick Google searches, read a little bit about the original cauldron, called the Cauldron of Rebirth, and then I did my reread of the series. Didn't look too deeply into Welsh mythology after that, because that was when I'd started kicking around ideas for my debut book series, and I was mostly just reading about Greek mythology. However, I mentioned in the last episode that for my second series, I wanted to do something with fairies. And the more I researched fairies to prep for that series, the more I found out that they're connected to Welsh mythology. I mean, they're connected to lots of other mythologies too. But because of my love for Chronicles of Prydain and because I knew it was inspired by Welsh mythology, I got really excited about the fact that fairies are so present in Welsh mythology specifically. And then I did what I do best. I fell down the rabbit hole. I invested in my own copy of the Mabinogion. Sorry if I completely butchered that pronunciation. But I also bought and read every other book I could find on Welsh mythology, and I listened to all the podcasts that I could find that mentioned it, and now I'm here talking to you about it. Okay, so now that I've rambled for forever, it's time to actually talk about what we're here to discuss today, the Cauldron of Rebirth. I do apologize in advance for any horrible mispronunciations I might make. To start, we need to talk about what the Cauldron of Rebirth is. If you're familiar with Welsh mythology, or Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain series, or even Disney's The Black Cauldron, you might already have an idea of what it is. But basically, the Cauldron of Rebirth is a magical cauldron, and if you put a corpse into it, the corpse will be resurrected the next day. In the Mabinogion, Bran the Blessed says that bodies put into the cauldron will be good as ever, except that the people will no longer be able to speak. The story involving the cauldron makes up the second branch of the Mabinogi, and it's become one of my favorite stories from Welsh mythology. This probably comes as no surprise, but it's definitely inspired some of the plot in my upcoming series. Book 1, The Bone Fairy, should be coming out in spring of 2025 if all goes as planned. If you'd like a free ebook, and if you don't want to miss any of the updates about Bone Fairy, be sure to sign up for my newsletter. Alright, now that we know what the Cauldron of Rebirth is, and that it's part of the second branch of the Mabinogi, I think it's high time we talk about its story. It's a really good one, and I hope you love it as much as I do. Our tale begins with Bran the Blessed, a giant and the king of Britain. He's hanging out with some of his brothers, watching the sea, when some ships appear in the distance. He tells his men to gear up and confront the ships, just to ensure that whoever is on their way here doesn't have nefarious intentions. Bran's men do as he says, and when they approach the ships, one of the ships raises a shield in peace. The men go to see who has come and what they want, and they find out that Matholwch, King of Ireland, has come to request Branwen's hand in marriage. Branwen is Bran the Blessed's sister, by the way. The men say, cool, let's take this to shore so we can have a meeting about it. Matholwch agrees, and he comes to shore. The meeting takes place, and it's agreed that Branwen will be given to Matholwch in marriage. They set a date and hold the celebration, and because Bran the Blessed is too big to fit into any buildings, They have the celebration in these tents rather than a house or a castle or what have you. So, Branwen and Matholwch are married, and everything seems fine. However, Bran the Blessed and Branwen have this half brother named Efnisian, who's described in the text as a quarrelsome man. And quarrelsome he is indeed. When he finds out that Bronwyn was married off to Matholwch without his permission, he is furious. He takes out his anger on Matholwch's horses. He cuts off their lips, their ears, their eyelids, and even their tails. Yikes. When Matholwch finds out that his horses have been mutilated, he's angry and confused. He's like, why would these people insult me like this if they were willing to let me marry a woman such as Bronwyn? And Bran the Blessed is like, crap, this is bad. We don't want Matholwch angry. So Bran says that he'll replace all the horses, and that he'll throw in a couple of other things to try and appease Matholwch. However, he can tell that Matholwch is still upset, and so he says, look, I'll increase your compensation for your troubles. I've got this cauldron that raises the dead, and I'm willing to give it to you to make this right. Matholwch is like, heck yeah, that sounds great. And so not only are his horses replaced, but he also gets the Cauldron of Rebirth. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal if you ask me. I mean, he got a wife and a cauldron that resurrects the dead out of this. And a few days later, he heads back to Ireland with Branwen and all his new stuff. Matholwch and Bronwyn get back to Ireland, and they receive a warm welcome. Everyone loves Bronwyn because she's super generous with whoever visits her. She gives the people brooches and rings and other jewels. She becomes pregnant and eventually gives birth to a little boy named Gwern. But while everything seems good on the outside, it turns out that there's trouble in paradise. It's been about 2 years, and the people of Ireland start talking about how Matholwch was insulted by Efnisian, and Matholwch's friends even start mocking him for letting it go so easily. But instead of, you know, not letting what they're saying get to him and explaining to his people that Bran the Blessed had more than made up for what happened, Matholwch instead decides to force his wife and the mother of his child to work in the kitchens as a maid. The lack of logic here is just, I don't know, man. Bronwyn did nothing wrong. Anyway, Bronwyn is forced to work like this for years, and in that time she trains a starling to talk and do as she asks of it. She writes a letter to her brother Bran the Blessed explaining what Matholwch is doing to her, ties the letter to the starling, and tells the bird to take the letter to Bran. Bran receives the letter, and he is not happy to hear about how his sister is being punished. He gathers an army, and they sail toward Ireland. But because Bran is so large, he can't fit on any of the ships, so he has to wade across the sea while everyone else is on a ship. When the Irish learn that Bran the Blessed and a whole army is coming for them, they decide to flee across this river called the Liffey. Sorry if I just butchered that. But, they flee across this river and destroy its bridge because there are lodestones on the riverbed and no one can sail across it. However, this doesn't really help them because Bran is so large that he uses his own body as a bridge, and his army makes it across. At this point, Matholwch knows he's screwed up. There's no escaping Bran the Blessed, so he sends his men to start negotiating how they can make this right. Finally, the Irish offer to make a house large enough for Bran to be able to fit in, and Bran accepts this offering because of Bronwyn. She doesn't want Ireland annihilated. So Matholwch and his guys build a house, but they decide that instead of putting all this crap behind them and moving forward in a positive way, they're gonna keep stirring the pot. You see, there are 100 pillars in the house that they built, and they put pegs on both sides of the columns, and then they put bags on each peg, and inside of each bag is an armed man. So it's my understanding that they're basically like trying to ambush Bran and his army with these 200 men. Now, Efnisian goes ahead of Bran and the rest of the army into the house, and he looks around at the bags and immediately knows something is up. He starts asking the men in the bags about what's in the bags, and they all tell him it's just flour, but he knows they're full of it and crushes their heads while they're still in the bags, one by one. When Efnisian reaches the last bag, the man in this one is wearing a helmet, but Efnisien doesn't let up until that guy is dead too. So at this point, Bran and his army show up at the house, and Mytholwick and his army do too. They talk and reconcile, and then they all sit down. Gwern, Branwen and Mytholwick's son, comes out. And Bran the Blessed and other people in Bronwyn's family are enjoying the company of the little boy. In the text, it says that everyone who saw Gwern loved him. Okay, so you'd think that this would be the end of the story. Everyone is finally getting along, and maybe they can just put all this nasty vengeance stuff behind them. However, you would be wrong. Efnisien gets butthurt that Gwern hasn't come to him yet. So when Gwern does come to him, finally, he decides to grab the little boy by the feet and chuck him headfirst into the fire. Yup, you heard that right. He murders his nephew for what feels like no reason at all. Not that any reason would be acceptable here, but you know what I mean. Of course, this shatters whatever semblance of cordialness there might have been between these two groups of people. And how could it not? Efnisien just murdered a child, his own nephew, who was also supposed to be the next king of Ireland. A battle breaks out between Bran's army and Mytholwick's army, and things get really bad. This is where the Cauldron of Rebirth finally gets to shine, though. The Irish start putting their dead in the cauldron, and each morning their corpses rise and go on fighting without a word. Pretty soon, the corpses outnumber Bran's army, and this is when Efnisien finally realizes what a screw-up he's been. He acknowledges that all of this is his fault. He started this feud, and even after it simmered down, he started it up again. So he hides among the dead bodies, and while he's still alive, the Irish throw him into the Cauldron of Rebirth, thinking he's one of their own corpses. And while he's inside the cauldron, he stretches himself out as much as he can. This breaks the cauldron into 4 pieces, rendering its powers useless, and he dies in the process. It says in the text that no one really wins the battle, and I have to agree. Bronwyn dies of a broken heart, and only 7 of Bran's men escape with their lives. Bran himself is hit in the foot with a poisoned spear. He asks his men to cut off his head, saying that his severed head will still talk to them afterward, and it does. It keeps them company for almost 90 years before they finally bury it. As for Ireland, it says that the only survivors are 5 pregnant women who give birth to sons, and their sons go on to repopulate the country. So, not the happiest story we've talked about on the podcast, but a fascinating one nonetheless. At any rate, that concludes the first section of the podcast. The second section will be all about creation, afterlife, and underworld myths from around the world, starting with Mesopotamian mythology, definitely a favorite of mine. However, I'll be switching to 1 episode a month from here on out. An episode a week just isn't sustainable for me long term. So if you're listening to this right when it comes out, you probably won't hear from me again until closer to the beginning of November 2024. Before I go, I thought I'd let you know that if you're interested in reading my free book, Wrath of Persephone, the link to download the ebook is in this episode's description. If you want more myths, folktales, and fairy tales, I've also included the link to my myths, folktales, and fairy tales blog in the description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time!